How does debilitating anxiety manifest as a consequence of specific negative vasanas? Which of the gunas primarily drives this state? How is the affliction tied to the ego, the over-identification with the body-mind? Is trauma often the seed that plants and reinforces these fear-based vasanas, creating the foundation for chronic anxiety? There is a growing interest in psychedelics as a treatment for trauma and anxiety based on the experience that they temporarily melt the ego. What does Vedanta say about this? Could this chemical temporary ego-dissolution serve as a bridge or a therapeutic pause for the suffering ego, similar to, but not as stable as, strengthening the intellect through sustained inquiry? What lesson is there in the difference between this transient external method and the non-dual realization achieved through internal practice? And for those who don't necessarily understand all of the Sanskrit, we've got gunas and vasanas. I'll explain the terminology as we go through. All right. Okay, so let's get on to this first aspect. How does debilitating anxiety manifest as a consequence of specific negative vasanas? Just to recap what we understand by the word vasana, perhaps the best way to get into the concept is by recalling the chronology of action: vasana, thought, desire, action. So if we are performing an action, we can say that there's some desire backing it. The reason I do something is because I desire some kind of outcome. And that outcome is associated with a higher sense of well-being. If I'm hungry, I desire food, I eat, knowing that at the end I'll be satiated. So there's a desire backing every action. Well, you can take one step back and say, well, what backs my desires? Where does desire come from? It arises from a consolidation of thought. If I have a thought about eating something, it doesn't drive me into the action. I might just have a thought, that pizza smells nice that person's eating. It doesn't make me go and eat anything, let alone pizza. It's just a thought. It doesn't have the kind of power or weight to motivate me into action. But if that thought repeats often enough, if it becomes consolidated, it becomes a desire, and then that motivates my action. So the same question arises, well, where does my thought arise from? Where's it coming from? The answer that Vedanta philosophy gives is vasana. So the idea then is that the vasana is the dormant, unmanifest, intangible prior cause of a thought. So they're said to exist in what's known as the causal body. So we have the gross body, which is the thing you can see in the mirror, the subtle body, which is the mind and intellect, our thoughts, our feelings, our attitudes, our likes and dislikes, our desires, emotions, including fear and anxiety. The causal body is the material from which those thoughts emerge that is not available for introspection. You can turn your attention inwards and discover some of the thoughts that you've been harboring. You can't turn your attention inwards and inspect the vasana. It is by definition intangible. So the question then, how does debilitating anxiety manifest as a consequence of specific negative vasanas? Think of it as seed, seedling, sapling. So the vasana you can think of as containing the potential for the beliefs that you hold around your life, who I am. So that's your identity. What is the good life? How does happiness arise? The meaning that you overlay onto your experiences. So someone at your work makes a comment about a project that you're a part of, and you don't care. It's a slightly negative comment, but hey, everyone can have their opinion. It doesn't matter. Another person hears the same comment said in the same way, and to them it means something quite different. To them it means I'm being criticized, I'm being judged for my work, they don't think I'm good enough. So it's the same stimulus in the same environment but it's striking a different meaning structure. And so because it strikes a different meaning structure, it's received differently. One person, it's I don't care. Another person, it's anxiety inducing. So our vasanas then contain the seeds of, or the dormant seeds of these beliefs, these meaning structures, our identity. It contains the seed for our drives and our motivations, the things we want to achieve, the desires. So then how does anxiety arise from vasana? This sort of gets into the third question, which I'll skip the second one and get to now. The vasana will express as our relationship to the world. And specifically when we're talking about the ego is, as the question states, the identification with the body-mind. It's the belief, it's the subjectively felt experience of I am this particular body-mind, this particular individual, this particular set of physical qualities and properties, emotional layers and contours, and intellectual structures. That's me. And it's not just something that we say when we recognize it, it's something that we are experientially going through, even when we're not aware of it. So best example to illustrate this is the dream state. You're in a dream and you're at a campsite with 1,000 other people, and the rain has come and you're upset and your car has been swept away. While you're going through that experience, you believe that you are the person who's getting wet in the rain and who's upset because their car has been swept away. That's identification with a set of qualities, properties, form, function. That's the ego. So the vasanas will then manifest as that structure of personality. The vasanas also manifest as that identification with whatever is arising in consciousness. It's me. It's happening to me. Now, when you wake up, you realize that those things weren't happening to me. Those things were happening, but they weren't actually happening to me. I just believed they were at the time because I was identifying with the perceptions, the emotions, and the thoughts. So anxiety cannot arise where there is no identification. And the Christian uses this phrase, over-identification. So you can think of that as not just the degree to which you identify, but rather the degree to which you ruminate. So identifying yourself as a particular personality structure is one thing, but it's the rumination on that which is the more direct cause of that anxiety. You know, one of the things that the Swami would say often is that anxiety is essentially what will happen to me. What about me? It's an over-exaggeration, it's an over-emphasis on yourself within that sort of narrative structure that we experience our lives through. We see ourselves as the main character in the story, and we relate everything back to me. And it's that relation of everything back to me which is that anxiety. Okay. So related to those vasanas then is the gunas. So the word gunas is translated as qualities. Again, the Swami uses this beautiful phrase, thought textures. So there are 3 gunas, tamas, rajas, and sattva. Tamas is characterized by ignorance, lack of knowledge. It's associated with lack of action, lack of motivation, lack of feeling, lack of response. Rajas is a higher state. That is a state where you are very much reacting to and responding to the world. There is thought, there's the movement of emotion, and there is desire and action. But all of that is centered around the ego. It's centered around personal desire. Both tamas and rajas tend to indicate, especially tamas, but also rajas, they both tend to indicate involvement. So involvement, again, is when we are fully identified with the contents of consciousness. The opposite of involvement is objectivity, where we have the ability to view the contents of consciousness as a witness, as if from a position once removed from what's really going on. So that sounds a bit like not being in the present moment. So it's important that we understand when we talk about objectivity as witnessing and as being removed from perception, emotion, and thought, it doesn't imply that we are not in the present, that we're not really there. Best example of objectivity is watching a movie. When you're watching a movie, you're fully there with all of the perceptions, emotions, and thoughts that are arising for you in consciousness, but you're not affected by the drama on the screen, or the trauma in the screen, or the loss and the heartbreak on the screen. You're not affected by it, you're objective. Because it's just a movie. I'm sitting in the audience. I am once removed and I'm witnessing what's going on the screen as well as what's going on inside my own mind and intellect. There's a flush of emotions and thoughts, a rush of experience. You're also objective to that. So even when you're heartbroken in the movie, it's not untenable to you. You don't try to make it stop. You're fully with your heartbreak or your fear or your anxiety in the movie, but it's totally fine. You're able to accept it and see it for what it is. So tamas and rajas then indicate this state of involvement. Sattva is the highest of the mental states. It implies clarity, seeing things as they are, the state of objectivity. And with it comes a calmness. There's no overreaction to things. So when we talk about anxiety, it's primarily in the realm of rajas. It's a highly active state. There's a lot of thought going on. There's rumination happening. There's a lot of emotional reaction to circumstances. There's that bubbling. There's going on. And it's also, as touched on, centered around me. What will happen to me? There is a personal investment, a personal desire associated with the circumstances to which you are not objective. So it's important to recognize. You can be personally invested in something and objective. You're watching any kind of sporting event and you really want your team to win. And there's anxiety. It's coming down to the wire. There's excitement. And if your team loses, there's disappointment. But because it's just a game, you don't feel so personally invested. And if your team does lose, yes, there's the natural disappointment that arises. But at the same time, you can't say that you're really affected by it because it's just a game. In fact, the reason that I watch sport is for the anxiety. I love that riding on the edge of my seat. Will my team win or lose? And if my team loses, there's a drama associated with that. And that's why I keep going back to it, so I can be objective while I am, quote unquote, personally invested. So how does anxiety arise from vasanas? Vasanas contain the seed of our anxiety because they contain our beliefs about ourselves, about the world, about how life works, what is important, what is meaningful, who I am, who I should be. And then they manifest in our environment. And when we are in that more rajasic state, we relate to our environment through the kind of personal involvement that was just discussed. Okay, next aspect of the question. Is trauma often the seed that plants and reinforces these fear-based vasanas, creating the foundation for chronic anxiety? Short answer is yes. Vasana arises from the consequences of our experiences. So if we use again that chronology of action, vasana, thought, desire, action, vasana, it's not just a chronology of action, it's a cycle of action. And once again, the analogy that we often use is that of a plant. Seed gives rise to seedling, that gives rise to sapling, sapling gives rise to the fully mature plant, which contains the fruit, which has seeds for more of itself. In a similar way, our experiences, and we're always having thoughts, desire, and actions, our experiences lay down those impressions. They lay down those vasanas. So it works in both directions. If you have experiences that are highly positive, loving, encouraging, then you create a set of vasanas around who you are, how the world works, that are positive, that are healthy, that are productive, that help you to move through life in a positive way. You can also have sets of experiences that lay down impressions or vasanas that are, as the question rightly points out, the seed for chronic anxiety. So there's a growing interest in psychedelics as a treatment for trauma and anxiety based on the experience that they temporarily melt the ego. What does Vedanta say about this? So Vedanta doesn't describe or discuss the use of things like psychedelic interventions or external interventions as a way of dissolving the ego. It's important that we recognize that what sounds like two things being similar on the surface may be very different underneath. Another example we've used here is talking about, say, meditation. We can broadly say meditation is a good thing for you. What do we mean by meditation? If by meditation we mean the practice of mindfulness, as we've talked about it, then yeah, that's a very different and healthy practice compared to meditation as dhyana, described in some of the Vedic texts. You're doing something very different with your attention in dhyana compared to mindfulness. On the surface, the word meditation is used for both. Man, you sit and close your eyes and you do something with your attention. So they sound very similar. But once you dig into the details, you find that while they are related, they're wildly different in terms of what you're doing with your attention and the kind of experience that you're having. So too here, we're using the term ego death or ego-dissolution. We're using it in two contexts. One is a therapeutic intervention based on a chemical, and the other is arising from many, many hours of the use of mind and intellect, cognitive practice, spiritual discipline. So does ego-dissolution mean the same thing in both contexts? Perhaps a better way to ask it is, what is the same and what is different? What's the same in both is that there is a diminishing of this self-reference. So if we think of anxiety, almost to oversimplify it, but just to help us get our heads around it, if we think of anxiety as, what about me? What will happen to me? I'm the main character of this narrative. It's all about me. If we think about that as being sort of the loop of anxiety and rumination, then what's the same in both psychedelic intervention and what we might call realization is that self-reference is diminished or ceased. It's not about me. And my understanding of this is only very surface, so take this with a big grain of salt. Some of the studies point towards similarities in brain activity. So there are parts of the brain that are active when we have this self-referential process going on. In both psychedelic intervention and in those who are, for example, experienced meditators, there is a diminished self-reference activity in that part of the brain. So the similarity can simply be put as you stop making it all about yourself. One is the result of years of practice, and the other is the result of, if you like, brain intervention. Where it's different is that the ego-dissolution that arises through sustained Vedic practice or spiritual practice is also associated with calmness. It's a highly sattvic state. Whereas when it's the psychedelic intervention, it's often associated with a kind of chaotic, disordered rush of sensory and emotional content as well. Don't go driving in your car while you have the egoless experience arising from mushrooms. Right? You're a danger on the road. But if you have that same egolessness associated with or arising from years of practice, you're a safe driver. You can function effectively. Talk to someone who's in the midst of ego death because they've taken ayahuasca. Try and have a normal conversation with them. It's impossible. So there's a massive difference there in terms of the levels of activity of the brain, activity in the mind, and the sense of coherence, chaos, and what you might consider just the contents of consciousness. One's a lot more chaotic. Could this chemical temporary ego dissolution serve as a bridge or a therapeutic pause from the suffering ego, similar to but not as stable as strengthening the intellect through sustained inquiry? The answer to that question really is for the researchers. What is the effect of psychedelic intervention? So I don't have the subject matter knowledge to really answer that question. Having said that, any experience that you have can create a lasting impression for you. If somebody performs an act of deep compassion and kindness for you, that can alter your perception of humanity, your perception of life, and make you a better person. No drugs, no meditation, no nothing, just someone being nice to you in a very deep, meaningful way. That can have a lasting impression. Now, the tendency is that we return back to baseline. But if you have a repeated series of these kinds of experiences, then you learn, actually, people aren't as terrible as what I had learned. People are a lot more compassionate and kind. And so you recognize compassion and kindness as a way to live. And you can become more of that yourself. In a similar way, you have an experience that is powerful, meaningful, let's say from the psychedelic experience, from the psychedelic journey, and that can result in a new perspective on who you are, what you are, and your relationship to the world. So if you do have that blurring of the self-other boundary in a psychedelic experience, you may retain that memory in the same way that you can retain the memory of a dream. The actual experience in the dream is gone, but there's something that remains. There's a residue, a scent that remains even when the incense is burned. That residue, that scent can remain with you. So yes, any experience can result in a positive impression. It's important to remember, of course, that once again, the psychedelic experience is often a highly intense one. And if the mind and intellect is not prepared, then all that happens is you get overwhelmed and dizzy, and it's a terrible experience for you. You've experienced ego death, but that was the last thing you wanted, because I like being me, and I like having a relationship with the world. I know who I am, I know where I am, and if you suddenly turn that on its head, all that you experience is confusion and trauma. I'm not stable. I don't know who and what I am. I'm completely lost. You know what it feels like to turn a wrong corner and suddenly be in a part of town you don't recognize and you don't know where you are. I feel lost. I don't like that. I'm not tethered to some kind of reality checking that I know, oh, there's the bus stop, I know where I am. That experience is unpleasant. Now you take that and put it on steroids. I don't know who I am. I don't know where I am. I don't know how to relate to the environment. I don't know what's real in terms of the contents of my consciousness. So for some people, when they have that experience, it's just needless suffering. Not to say that the psychedelic intervention has no use. It can open a window to what is possible in the sense of sort of a non-dual realization of the distinction between self and other is in fact just an illusion. It's a cognitive, emotional construct. It feels as real as any aspect of the dream, but it is still just a dream. It can open the window and give you that conviction that this is something that lies in my future. I can remember it, just as I can remember the joy that I had in the dream. So you can move towards it. So it can act as an attractor. It leaves an impression. It leaves something for you to follow. And then you can get into a more daily, rigorous, practical practice. If you are prepared and if you're going into it in the right way, then yes, the resulting blurring of those boundaries, the resulting temporary loss of ego, can act as a bridge to overcoming anxiety. And this is, as I understand it, what some of the research is describing, is that psychedelic therapy can help with things like PTSD, anxiety, and so forth. I have read a research thesis that used psychedelics in a clinical setting. So he's a doctor, he went through the appropriate boards of ethics and so on and so forth. And a number of the participants returned back from their psychedelic journeys and they report having a hugely diminished fear of death. Now, was that sustainable? Okay, the report that I read didn't do a 6-month, 6-year, 10-year follow-up. But the point is that when they had returned from the psychedelic journey, when they were no longer under the influence, that diminished fear of death remained. Why? The way it's explained is simply reduction of ego. I am more than this body. I am more than just the contents of my mind and the structures of my intellect. There's something to me that is much deeper than just what I experience on the 1% surface. And so if this body falls away, which it will, it doesn't matter as much because I don't fall away with it. So could this therapeutic intervention be similar to, but not as stable as, strengthening the intellect through sustained inquiry? The strengthening of the intellect through inquiry, it's important that we understand what that means. it's not just the ability to think and reason and come up with good answers to questions or draw conclusions or make good choices. It is through inquiry, reflection, contemplation, mindfulness, and ultimately meditation that these same insights around your relationship to the world and your relationship to the contents of your own consciousness are revealed. They are, as the question points out, more stable. They are retained longer, and you can also function in the world while they are there. The strengthening of the intellect means that you have revealed insights about the nature of who and what you are that are retained. And that's not just through inquiry. So I'm putting my own meaning of the word inquiry here. It's not just through inquiry around studying a text. It's a contemplative practice of inquiry as well, in which you're not trying to get an answer to something. Contemplation is more around sitting with and witnessing what emerges in the contents of consciousness and looking for the source or the cause or the space in which all that arises. So the short answer is yes. It can act as a bridge to deeper insight, and whether it's as stable as intellectual inquiry or contemplation, I think would depend upon the nature of the experience and the individual. It's important to remember the distinction between state and trait. So you may practice a loving kindness or a compassion meditation or mindfulness practice. That doesn't immediately make you compassionate. Even if during your mindfulness practice you were filled with a universal compassion, you wanted the well-being of conscious, sentient creatures all across the universe. It wasn't centered around my cat or my dog or my parents or my children or even myself. It was truly just a universal feeling of compassion. I was compassion. That doesn't mean that you're going to carry that with you wherever you go. When you come out of the experience, yes, there's a degree to which you're changed, minuscule, just by half a degree. And so you kind of return to baseline. So you've gone from having a state of compassion back to a state of what you might call baseline. But the more you experience that state, the more it becomes a stable trait. As you think, so you become. And the analogy that is presented in one of the Vedic texts is of taking a white cloth and dipping it in yellow dye. You hang it up and you dry it, and it's very slightly yellow. Dip it in again, let it dry. It's slightly more yellow. The more times you do this, soon it becomes properly, permanently yellow. It's become the trait of the cloth is now yellowness. In a similar way, one of the studies around looking at those who have practiced mindfulness or meditation, there's something like 10,000 hours as a minimum of mindfulness that has been reported by the participants. So it's not just that you can have an experience and you're changed. It's consistent practice of being in that state. What lesson is there in the difference between this transient external method and the non-dual realization achieved through internal practice? There's multiple lessons. Perhaps that's the key one. The distinction between state and trait. Perhaps the other lesson or the other key aspect to learn from this is the degree of control. It's very much volitional when you have a spiritual practice centered around gaining insights into the nature of consciousness and the nature of who and what you are. You dictate the terms. And so in that regard, there's more, if you like, guardrails to it. Because it's more volitional and because you are the initiator of the practice and the process, it's more rooted in your insights. Whereas for a psychedelic intervention, it's being done to you by the chemical, if you like. So you're more at the mercy of the external environment. The other aspect to remember is that you can decide, I'm going to practice mindfulness every day. I'm going to do it first thing when I wake up, or last thing before I go to bed, or whatever, or twice a day for 20 minutes. You can do your mindfulness and then go about your business. You can't decide I'm going to take 6 grams of mushrooms every day in the morning and then go about my business. You can't operate. You're not able to be in control of your own life in that way. So a mindfulness or a contemplative practice is something that you can really weave in and get momentum in.